David, thank you for joining me tonight. How are you doing?
Of course. Doing pretty well, thanks. How about yourself?
Doing good, doing good. Actually, done a few of these interview or recorded a few of these interviews at this juncture. You're the first person that I actually went to high school with that I'm doing one of these with, so it's gonna be a good perspective there. We'll get to compare notes, I guess. But before we kind of get into the whole background experience, we actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we ran into each other at the school's AAPI celebration, not this past year, but I want to say last year.
Yeah.
And I don't know, for me, it's always seeing like just even some of these, just one, just like celebrations, but also even like culturally specific student groups, like remembering when we were in school, it often it feels like a trip to me, but also seeing, I'll just say like for seeing the students who kind of like this is the experience they just like grow up in. It's the only one they know is in a weird way, it feels like it's nice that it's something, and I don't mean to say they take it for granted, but it's nice that it's something that they can take for granted, if that makes sense.
Oh, for
But
sure. It's progress. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know, like when when you come to the school for like these celebrations, you see like these kind of like active student groups. I guess like what I don't know, what thoughts does it bring to you as someone who, again, we went to school in like what, graduated like 06, 07. So
Yeah, I mean, the early 2000s and the 90s was definitely a different landscape. I mean, for these students now, it's like an incredible like environment they can be in, right? It's like the Asian community can come together with like the Indian community, and they can come together with, other, communities, African American communities, and you have this huge boiling, melting pot of like minorities, right? And I feel like in Lake Oswego, it's starting to coalesce. You see it in like the Asian festival. And I was like, wow, there's like a really strong presence of like active minority students, but also ones that want to be like culturally aware. It's like, especially like I think in a lot of the Chinese and uh like families and students that I see in like Oswego, like most of them have like their parents like importing culture on them like at a young age pretty hard, right? So it's definitely something that's like ingrained and kind of like humbles them in some ways. So I feel like in a lot of regards they've tried to, support Asian rights, support those kind of movements just because culturally it's like ingrained in them in some ways, right? It's important to them in some ways. So I feel like, yeah, you're seeing like a stronger movement in the youth today than when we had, back in our days. Obviously, we didn't have the numbers, right? The awareness wasn't there, the environment was different. So nowadays, it's more progressive or it's more known, and obviously, like, there's the optics are different. So there's an opportunity for them to kind of grow and like flourish. But they've done a tremendous job. When I go to that festival and I ran into you, I was really pleasantly surprised because honestly, like, when I go to those things, I see a lot of people I recognize that are above my age or below my age, but like my age, no, or like I'm like the only person like my age. So I was like, oh wow, Bruce, nice to see you. Because like yeah, we get minorities, we can all relate to each other's stories, but if we can support each other, it's a great thing. And you see people of all races, ethnicities, ages at that festival. A lot of them are for the food, obviously, but like, in general, they stick around for the show. There's a lot of booths, so they've done a really good job with it.
and it's funny you mentioned the food. At this, I had a meeting at, it runs all day, and I had like a meeting at the beginning of the festival. So it's like I came a couple hours into it, everything was sold out, and it's just like
Yeah,
this is this is great. Also, dang,
yeah, it's good, but then it's really disappointing if you didn't show up early. Yeah, my mom showed up super early just so that she could snag the food. She's like, I was first in line. I was like, oh man. But people, yeah, I was really pleasantly surprised to see you there. And honestly, like, the turnout for last year, like the first few years I went, I was like, wow, this is like way better than I expected. They put on a good show with a talent show, and they end it with like martial arts, and they have some, some real talent individual pieces in that, show itself that do like, the string instruments and things like that. So yeah, it's really great what they can grow up with now. If they can take it for granted, obviously that's great. But I think a lot of them are like, actually pretty into it or proactive, and it doesn't seem like it's as like weird or maybe nerdy to be into like it might have been are pushed upon in our generation, older generations. So I think it's much more meta or much more like, just accepted. So
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, like you said, it's just good seeing, yeah, just in being in these spaces, when you talk about that age difference where it's usually, students currently going through it or, you know, people much older working in the city or working in the school district. So like seeing each other, and I also understand why a lot of people, specifically like students of color, went through the system. Like once they get out, are like, yeah, I don't, you know, want to come back. But like, I think that's also a measure of just like, once again, when you talk about that progress and what happens when you have, again, just very active students who are able to like really explore and celebrate culture in a way that, like you said, was just not, it wasn't like that in Hello High School when we were going. But to that point, you talk about like what years were you in the LO school system?
yeah, so I can talk about it from day one, but I have a pretty good recall. I can actually probably name most of the teachers I grew up with. So I went to Oak Creek, and Oak Creek Elementary being like in Westlake Elementary, Lake Oswego. So it's kind of like the heart of Lake Oswego High School area, kind of like the suburb part of it, right? It was obviously a huge, we had a pretty big district, but in general, you know, there's tons and tons of elementary schools kind of condensed in that area. Lake Grove, you have Forest Hills. So it's just like one neighborhood over. Like that kid would be like, you'd be playing with them, but he'd be going to a completely different grade school. It's kind of weird like that. So I went to Oak Creek Elementary from kindergarten to sixth grade. And, I was moved to America when I was one. I was born in Taiwan. So basically, I grew up in America. I grew up kind of like learning English. But in our household, we only spoke Chinese. We only spoke Mandarin. And that was kind of on purpose. My parents were like, as soon as you step out of the house every time, you're just going to be speaking English no matter what, pretty much. So when we're in the house, we're going to keep it Mandarin. We're going to speak Chinese. So the whole idea was like, you know, I would kind of be learning two languages. And I remember in kindergarten being kind of quiet, not really speaking that much because my English was like good, but I didn't feel that comfortable speaking, especially like in public with kids. So I'd play with kids, but I was very quiet. And I remember that specifically. And then first, second, third grade, fourth grade, fifth, sixth grade, all went pretty normal. Like I remember, so for kindergarten, I had Miss Learman. First grade, I had Miss Nagelman. Second grade, I had Miss Wynn. Third grade, I had Mr. Carlson, or yeah, oh no, Miss Vest. Fourth grade, I had Mr. Carlson. Fifth grade, I had Mrs. Richardson because she was a sub, which is for Miss Safety. And then sixth grade, same teacher. But I had Miss Schultz for math as well. So a lot of like Miss Schultz was like a seminal Oak Creek teacher. Miss Learman stayed there for a long time. Like a lot of those teachers I would come back to when I was like in my like late 20s and 30s, like because I knew a bunch of kids that were going there. I'd be like visiting Oak Creek. I'd be like, oh my God, Miss Learman's still here. Like, oh my God, like Miss Schultz is still here. So like, yeah, I feel like a lot of those teachers imparted like really good, um, I guess you could say like fundamentals and like foundational knowledge. Like they were just good people, right? So I feel like at Oak Creek, it was just like in decent hands or in good hands. But like, it was a small, like kind of tight knit community in that area. Pretty much everyone knew each other. So like, there's only like three or four. So like you count the amount of Chinese people like in Lake Oswego in that area on your hand. Like, so basically, like you stuck together, or like we would when we moved here, they would kind of impart some knowledge, like the things like were like cultural norms, like things you should do for like the school district and blah blah blah. We moved to LO for the school district. My parents were like, when they moved to Oregon with my grandparents, were like, what's the best school district? They just ask people, right? Like Chinese people just ask, like, what's the best this, what's the best that? They'll ask that to like everyone. Like that's just kind of their thing because they just want to know what's popular, what's good. So obviously the people say like Oswego or some other school, like Westland or something like that. So they moved there for the idea of like education. My sisters were 10 and 12. They're actually 10, 12 years older. So they're kind of moving for their opportunities more than mine, which is fine, like which makes complete sense. I was only 1 year old at the time, but obviously it would be good for me either way when I grew up. So the whole idea was like, uh, you know, Lake Oswego education, the junior high, high school, you know, just had normal, like I was '06, just a year ahead of you. So and you were '07, right? But yeah, Oak Creek, I felt like was a good transition. Junior high was kind of yeah, that was like the rigor morale, but that was kind of the individual, background. Sorry, that was too like a big too much.
Not at all. And my parents kind of made a similar calculation. Like my dad lives in Oregon, mom was coming from New Jersey at the time, but specifically like she worked in education. So, doing the same thing as far as like researching what's the school district that's, you know, where is the school with the best reputation? What's, kind of get that, I don't know, return on investment, I guess. So yeah, it's interesting. Like I feel like that's a very common, a lot of people's LO story, I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
especially if you're coming at like from the outside, right? I feel like
mm,
some of a lot of minorities too, like or a lot of like non-white people are like basically if they're not born into it, you're coming in from the outside. A lot of them are like, oh, moving into like Mountain Park apartments or like the ones in like Westlake or like there's like just to get into the school district right away, like just to find housing and then like moving into something that's like more permanent. So you'd see that like situation come up all the time. Like I had a lot of friends that were like, oh, their parents moved in for the school district and then they're like figuring out like like they're asking around like basically like what's the best school or like what's the best opportunity. And so, by the time we hit junior high and high school is better because you have like the alliance, right? You have 5 or 6 individual elementary schools coming together. So if you have one or two or three Asians or black people or Mexicans, basically you have like a little bit of a squad by the end of like by the time a junior high starts, and they're like, oh my God, we have like 10 of us, we have like 8 of us. This could actually be like, feasible. So the whole idea, I feel like a junior high and high school is, oh, we would start to form like, you know, bigger friend groups, but like bigger cliques, but it was, oh, pulling from like a bigger diverse melting pot. Like, oh, these 2 Asian dudes that went to like Forest Hills. It's like these 2 Korean dudes. It's like you had no idea like these people existed until junior high and high school. I remember that being pretty exciting. So like the two things that I always felt most exciting were like new classes and like new people in your class. Just because I was like, oh, who's like, basically like similar to us or like can vibe in certain ways because we just don't have enough people like in our current situation sort of thing. So junior high, high school, yeah, that might have been the impetus for a lot of like these larger friend groups where I was like, oh, 5 or 6 of us. And we have some Korean people, and we have some Chinese people, and some, Filipino people like Phil Hutzel and like Alex Kim, things like that. So there was like, I think a little bit of a better like environment once coming around like in the 2000s, right? Because there was a little bit of progress in that, or like a little bit of safety in numbers, but I think definitely though for like the Hispanic community and for like African American kids, you guys definitely had a smaller, tighter knit like that was definitely harder in a lot of regards, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think a lot of again, just like numbers, small numbers, all the other stuff that just comes with LO, makes it definitely be strained. And I think it can be hard with I don't know, like when you're talking about just like kind of like getting to junior high, finding other people. I always think about, especially when it comes to young people out here, like where are the community spaces or where are even just not even necessarily like community, like intentional community spaces, but even just like gathering spots,
Yeah.
like where would people
Spot in
go? Like,
school.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like, so I ask you, like, like one, were there places where you felt like you would go for community outside of just sort of like, just informal kind of like we gather where we gather? Or was it kind of just like, you know, this friend's living room, the park type thing?
No, that's a good question. But I think if you did have a class with someone, or if you did like looking back on that's a good question because I originally thought no, not really, but now I think about it and actually put some thought into it. There's totally like examples, right? So let's say you have like lifetime sports, and that was a class that like you're gonna have fun and you're looking forward to, and the whole idea is like, oh, if I have someone fun or if a friend in that same lifetime sports class, it's gonna be like a ball, it's gonna be a jam, right? Otherwise, like just don't know anyone. That it's gonna be a normal class, not that big a deal, but if you have people that, oh, this is like dope. Me and this like kid can kind of like, just hang out every single day on Lifetime or something like that. And I was like, oh, a good idea would be like or a good example in like Lifetime would be like, me and Paul Lu and like Q Choi and like a couple other kids and like Everett and we'd all play like badminton or something like that. Like, because basically like the nets are available in the old gym at all times if you want to pull them out. So at lunch we would play, or like during like lifetime we would play a lot. So there's definitely like some class opportunities, but other than that, there's definitely like rhetoric or like regiment. I guess not rhetoric, regiment, where you basically like go to the same spot or the same table every time and you just kind of like congregate there. Like pattern is a habit. And then like at break we might just go to like stay outside in the hallway or like in a specific hallway. And then every day might just be like kind of like falls into routine because you kind of need routine to like save yourself or like something, not to like, well, something that I guess to look forward to in some ways, right? If you're like, oh, this class sucks, I'm like looking forward to break, or I'm looking forward to lunch. Like you have something where it's like, oh, I know we're just gonna have like a same routine. And if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. It's not that big a deal, but at least you have like some rigor morale because humans are, creatures of habit, creatures of routine. So
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about it, asking that question, but yeah, now I kind of like reflect on just like, yeah, stuff like playing cards at lunch, you know, you mentioned badminton. I thought the best part about that was just, just being obnoxious high schoolers and just doing like not even badminton, but just like I mean, my friend Barnum when we were in in Lifetime, it was just like we're literally just like laying on the floor, just
oh yeah. Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, or you sit on the ground or something like
yeah,
that. Yeah,
just
yeah.
just get
You're
like a
control.
bunch of birdies, just sit there.
Or
Whoops, can't get it.
you
Oh
play
no.
two-handed. Two-handed is actually really fun. You do a wheel a little bit, like you just go left-handed. Like that's actually kind of fun.
Yeah.
But like other than that, like we definitely had rigor morale outside of school, and like Phil Hutzel's house was a gathering spot. Phil Hutzel was definitely like there's definitely 2 or 3 years of high school where that was kind of like congregating, like for us in general because I don't know. You always have a person's spot or like house or a friend or a set of parents that are a little bit more lax, a little bit more chill, just hanging out. So that just ends up just being the hangout spot over and over again. So that kind of like was our hangout spot for a lot of time, and and then eventually high school senior year, I feel like everyone had their guard down a bit more. The clicks didn't weren't as clicky, and we kind of realized this is like, oh, our senior year, let's send it, have fun, but like also like we have no reason to like uh hold up any real walls against each other for no reason. So like let's say like the popular clique and like the girl clique and like the jock clique and like the nerd clique and then like the athlete nerd clique, the mathletes clique, they all kind of like didn't really care about lines anymore. So everyone was kind of very chill with each other in senior year. It was just chill. I was like, oh, people are a little bit more mature. People aren't really like being, you know, dicks for no reason. But basically, there's not really, yeah, not really a good explanation other than people like matured a little bit, right? So it was good to see that at least. And then, yeah, I think in general, Phil Hutzel's house became like a meeting spot for almost like a larger like scene or a larger party. So like pretty much anywhere one would show up there, or like when he would have something going on, just because it was like a very inviting place at that point. So we had like a good like setup there, and I think it did like make the overall like social situation a little bit. We didn't do any crazy things like too out of the norm. So I think it was a good social environment for us to just like hang out in. So
Yeah, yeah. And you kind of talked there about, well, it's just sort of like so far, got more about like the general just high school experience. And yeah, definitely, when you said that sort of like that senior year with the walls come down thing, because it definitely felt sort of that same thing with our class. And it's just, you know, just interesting how that happens time wise. But specifically when it comes to like experiences, conversations around race at LOSD, can you just talk about that a little bit more?
yeah. So I mean, like I think in general, you definitely would have like some like instances where like oh someone's being like someone will make a joke or someone will like do something where they're not like completely malicious, right, with their intent, but they're being, I guess you could say, like ignorant either way, right? So it's kind of a case where oh you chalk it up to oh you could just say something back, or you like in general there weren't too many examples that stuck out just because I feel like if you're the kind of person, or if you're the kind of person to like speak back or to like re-engage with them, it's not necessarily going to happen as much. But I wouldn't say that's the case for everyone, right? So stuff will have still like someone will still say something, or like you'll still encounter racism, or like some sort of like passive aggressive of that nature. That stuff happens all the time, especially more public, but I don't think like in general it can't always attribute it to malice. In some ways, like if you can make it known or obvious and kind of act above it, I always feel like kill them with kindness is somewhat the best way of doing it. But like obviously, there's a lot of instances where you should say something like and definitely retort. Um, I had a very specific example with a teacher who no longer works at Lake Oswego High School, so I could probably speak on it. Actually, it's actually a pretty good story. But I wrote a little mini blog about it on my a website like a while back. But basically, in sophomore year, yeah, sophomore high school history class with Mr. Moore, it was Cinco de Mayo, and one of his students was near the front of class. He was giving a speech, and he was kind of like well liked by Mr. Moore. It was kind of like a little bit of a teacher's pet. I'm not even saying that to be facetious, but it was kind of true. So he was letting him like have the floor up front, and Nick was the person was wearing a sombrero, and it was Cinco de Mayo, and the person wasn't Hispanic or whatever, and like Mick was just giving a speech just like normal, and then the bell rings, and then everyone just files out, about to leave, and then Mr. Moore says, "Class dismissed. See ya, and he says, "See ya, El Mico." And I just like sit there and I just say like under my breath, just real quick, I was like, "That's racist." And like I was just packing up my bags, and like right as I say that, like both of them lightning, Mr. Moore yells, "Hey, come see me after class." And I was like, "Oh shit, what happened?" And my friend Granny Grove was sitting right across from me. He like looks at me. He's like, "Dude, you okay?" So I was like, he was like almost like, "You want me to stay?" sort of thing. I was like, "No, just go," sort of. But uh, the whole thing transpired really poorly after that. So I, just kind of sitting there, grabbing my things, and he's like standing there next to the door. And pretty much most people have left, and he just gets up, literally about 2 or 3 inches from my face, and was like, "You don't ever talk like that in front of me, in front of my class. You don't ever call me a racist." And I was like, "I didn't call you racist. I said what you said was racist." I said, "Oh, that's racist." And he was like, "You don't ever call me a racist." And he repeated that line like a few times, and I literally repeated the line, "I didn't call you a racist. I said what you said was racist." And literally that was like 2 or 3 exchanges, but I remember two specific things: that he was very, very close, and that when I looked down, like his lip was like quivering hard. Oh, he was like very, very upset. And like apparently when I said that when I was like, "Oh, that's racist," like that triggered him really hard, because I just said it kind of under my breath. I didn't say it very loud, and everyone's like leaving the class. I don't even think most people heard it. And then like I remember when I said it, it was like you go to the doctor and you hit, like they hit your knee like a reflex. It was literally like so reflexive. There's nothing I could have done. I was like, because he said as a joke, "See you later, El Nico," and I was like, "Oh, it's racist." I was like, literally, I couldn't avoid it. Um, but it was just like he was saying it so off, just as off the cuff that I was just saying it so off the cuff. Um, and then he just said, "See me later after class," like right away. And so I was like, "Oh, damn." Really struck a nerve. And so the lip quivering, all that. I just remember leaving the class after that. My friend was waiting after me and kind of just being normal. And then 2 or 3 days later, my mom and my sister like tell me they're like, "Oh yeah, we met up with your teacher and the vice principal, which was at time was Mr. Park." Which is like, oh, Mr. Park and Mr. Moore, and then my sister, my mom, and I was not included in the conversation. And they just came to the conclusion, or like basically the logical like answer that like we're both very sensitive people, in that like we're very I guess you could say uh you know outspoken, but this word sensitive was used very very often. I was like, oh, he's sensitive, I'm sensitive, that's why it happened. But they totally didn't get the full picture. I wasn't even there. But so I the whole but at that point, Mr. Moore was just like very, very like on guard, very nice to the overwhelmingly nice. He was already we had already had not a terrible relationship going on. We were pretty decent, pretty talkative. But I think like that just randomly struck a nerve for whatever reason. He was just like kind of bothered by it. Like he was, yeah. I remember just being like, dude, I barely even like I like almost whispered. I almost didn't even say it just because it was so quiet. But the whole idea was like what he said was kind of weird. And Mick is, or yeah, I'm not gonna say lots like give a person away, but he's not Hispanic, right? He's white. So him wearing that and kind of like being declarative like in front of class like that, it was kind of a little weird. The optics on it were weird. Like nowadays it'd be a little bit weird, just because it wasn't as like this wasn't trying to be like super, it's not like trying to be respectful kind of thing. So the whole idea of it was like, oh, this is already kind of weird. This person is doing this weird kind of thing, and the teacher's just kind of, just being fine with it. And then he just says that thing. So I was just like, that was like the cherry on the top. So the whole idea was a little weird. And then the whole year goes by pretty fine. Mr. Moore is super nice to me. And then he, I've seen him like a few times outside of school because he's super like he's into movies and a few other things. So I see like Lord of the Rings like release or something like that. I see like the Matrix sequel release, something like that, like at the local Tiger Theater. And he's nice. He's just normal after that. But like a little over nice, just I think to make up for it. Or just to like kind of have good like optics on it. But overall, like, I always didn't have like fully like great like perspective on like him as a teacher up until that, and then that kind of like a little bit confirmed it. And then in general, yeah, the response was weird. Nowadays, like I would have liked, no, the student would probably be more like involved in that, but they probably wouldn't be involved in the conversation just because they want to keep it with adults. And I get that to some degree, but honestly, like looking back on it, I like kind of retorted a little bit to my mom and my sister. I didn't want to like tear into them about it, obviously, right? In retrospect, but the whole idea was like, man, I really should have been included on it. That perspective was weird. I know the whole story. I have like very, very clear memory on it. I could like almost say a few things like um like we're in the conversation. So it's really like a case where like in general nowadays, the optics on it would be totally different. But that was more normalized back then. Nowadays people wouldn't even say anything. Or nowadays or back then people wouldn't even say anything. So but yeah, that was a weird, just a one-off. Other than that, pretty much every teacher like had pretty good like perspective, and then like respect overall the culture and race. I remember Mr. Anders asking a few like specific questions like to me like in the middle of class about like like of some of like the Chinese culture stuff when he was teaching it. Like just like I think he was trying to be a little bit respectful, or just like not to be like overbearing or weird about it. So he would like ask like individual questions on like confirming like the name or like how to pronounce it or something like that. And it was just like, oh, okay, he's actually trying a little bit. And I think he's like actually an eighth or a quarter Japanese too. So I was like, okay, there's a little bit of perspective. So overall, I think the educational perspective on race was, really good. Students our grade were pretty good. I feel like maybe in your grade, they might have been a little bit less, they probably might have had a little bit less perspective, but that's just me seeing it from afar. So I don't know how you saw it, but
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I think like when I kind of like try and like break it down, the pie of what different types or like races experiences look like, most of, at least from my perspective in LO, is like sort of that this is couched in a joke or it's like casual passive aggressive thing.
yeah,
Like there are some like, there are definitely certain individuals who stood out amongst, a town that has a reputation to like be that person. It says a lot. And there were some of them, but for the most part, it's kind of like more of that, it's a joke type thing. And some of the stuff, I think about, reflect on later and be like, that there's a little more to that than just kind of like the casual joke, or the fact that it was just like so constant and casual was something just kind of like think about and be like, okay, that's weird. But like when you talk about that experience where it's like everything is not fine, but like it basically goes to like 0 to 100, where you have teachers that's where you kind of like just point out, like you said, like you're just saying something under your breath, and that becomes this face-to-face confrontation with someone who has considerably more power in this situation. Never mind having a meeting afterwards with your family without you, which is it's just bizarre. Like in
yeah.
any context, even time considered,
What's
wild.
funny too is that like I feel like I barely or I don't even know if I told my mom or my sister or like my own family. Just and so I feel like she must have been like, oh, worried that there could be blowback or that I would be up riled up. When really I was just like, yo, bro, like that was kind of weird. That was kind of racist. Not a big deal. Let's move on. Like when and that's the thing. He like I feel like certain teachers' perspective is a little bit more like skewed than others, right? So it's not like I felt like he was outright racist, but I definitely don't feel like he was as open minded or like as like had outwardly as perspective as like some other teachers, and tons of them did. And like Oswego in like junior high school, very seminal teachers, and I can like definitely remember like specific grades where it was like seventh grade English. Mrs. Bauer was like incredible, and there was like definitely periods of time where I was like, wow, I would have never appreciated something like literature if I never had like eighth grade English, right? Or it was like, oh, I could actually like dive into it and see perspective, and people weren't like too, you know, worked up about us being like analytical about it and diving and going in, because it was like everyone was kind of like sunk in. So I feel like in general there's definitely really good perspective or like moments of perspective where I was like, you know sophomore history class or like you know English class with Mr. I forgot his name, he still works there. But in general, like there's definitely like teachers that leave marks on you in positive ways, and that's definitely testament to like them as teachers and them as educators. And when I go back there the Asian festival, I would like see the current like staff and like basically like go through it and I'm like, wow, there's still like 40% or like 50% that I can still recognize or like still hear. It's like really incredible because it's definitely like you know hard to, I guess you could say, like not necessarily endure, but it's definitely like a hard practice where you have to like work at it, right? It's not an easy thing to like educate young minds. So
Yeah, and I think that support factor is so important. You know, we talk about sort of like the experiences and so much of these interactions kind of being more passive aggressive, more kind of just like casual. I think oftentimes it kind of like comes down to more so like what students are supported, or what students, especially when there's like not a lot of like systems in place in general to take care of these things. So, having some of these teachers who I know like for like I had some very much horror story experiences, but then I also did have some teachers who were like, "Hey Bruce, you're interested in the Black Panthers. show this resource to you. Let me show this to you. You know, where like I said, like for the many horror stories out there, I also just had some real supports that I can say were like instrumental in me getting me through.
Yeah.
And coming back today and looking at again with like some of these student groups, some of the teacher advisors, and honestly having more perspective now, just again just being older, having been a professional and seeing oftentimes I'm kind of just honestly just like stressed out on their behalf because I see like what it takes to maintain and like do all that and like just the general stress that's on teachers, never mind. So like just the particulars of this environment. But yeah, can you just talk a little bit more as far as you talk about like supportive teachers or mentors or just like adult figures in LO and like what I guess like what that looked like?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's definitely moments where, um, you know, every individual like teacher, like when I was going through those teachers at like Oak Creek, like Mrs. Learman in kindergarten was like really, really seminal in being like a good mother figure. And like I think she stayed there for like 20 years, 25 years after that. And so like she had like an incredible legacy. And so like, I feel like a lot of the early teachers, like, um, that were there, like each had a different like personality, each had a different kind of trait. Like I remember my second grade teacher, Mrs. Wynn, she was almost like an archetypal complete opposite. She was like, you know, probably about 5 foot or like 5'1", had like, curly hair, but she was like smart as whip. And then she was like, had glasses and she was very like straight to the point, very like kind of like scientific. But I remember like learning or kind of advancing or having my most like kind of like progressive like math year in her year because she was also like the advanced math teacher. So like I would just stay in her class whenever like would basically would shift for math. So I was like, oh wow, I get to see like her kind of shift into like a different mode. And I was like, wow, she's like, obviously pretty smart, but it was a completely different experience, a completely different teacher than like obviously kindergarten's gonna be different, but like a teacher who's like just trying to be like more of a nurturer or like a good educator or like a good facilitator in general versus someone who's much more like technical or someone who's much more like scientific with their approach and tries to like be analytical and like teach you like hard concrete things. So I was like, oh, very very diverse set of like educators. And I remember like in fourth grade, Mr. Carlson's class, I had like we had an art project. We had to draw like birds. What we were like, we all had to choose a different bird. I think I like yeah, blue jay or whatever. And I remember spending a lot of time on it and being like, oh, it's so bad. Like it wasn't terrible, but like I remember I like just had high standards for. I was like, oh, I'm just so bad, or like I'm not that great. And I remember like turning and being like, I'm just gonna bomb. And like I was like so anxious about it for some reason. I was like so worked up that I was just gonna get like a completely terrible grade. I think I remember getting like a B plus or an A minus on it. And like he wrote like a decent note. I was I was like very encouraged by it. I was like, oh, that's actually very nice of him. I was like, but I was also thinking in my head, I'm like, he's just probably being nice. I wasn't even that great. But the whole idea was just like, oh man, like uh the perspective of what you have, and I think like the mindset of like a teacher like growing up, like looking back on it, like or like looking at it now, it's easy to tell that like these adults are trying to be a little bit more like positive in a lot of ways, but also like I think as a child you sometimes don't always know, like you might get intimidated by a certain teacher. You might think that like, oh, they're definitely like a lot more judgy, right, in a certain way. So I was like, oh man, like definitely like he's going to be a harder grade than like someone else or something like that. But yeah, I think like general compassion was definitely something that existed that was like a good thing that most educators are shown. I definitely think that there's um like examples that stood out individually, but um you know junior high, high school, like all I think like the math department was really strong in LL High, and like a lot of them stayed there, have been there for a while. Math guys are kind of like that. They're kind of nerds, right? And it's kind of like hard to like be into teaching math, but if you're into that, you're like that's kind of your thing. But I remember a lot of those teachers, like if you're like struggling really hard, they would like find ways to try and help you out, or it'd be like they would seek ways to be like to try and help you out, which was always very positive. Because you get anxious, so you'd be like, oh, like I'm getting destroyed in this class, or like this class is really hard, or like, it's basically like you feel like intimidated by everything. And like sometimes the teacher, like the material can feel intimidating, even if like that's not really the case, right? So
Yeah, yeah. And kind of to not so much to the support point, but just yeah, kind of think about now having some years just having some years removed from being in the LO school system, the perspectives that come with that. How would you say, if at all, that like the LO experience shaped both how you move in life and specifically how you move in your career?
no, that's a great question. Honestly, like I feel like when I talk about this with my friends, like I have a couple of friends that are really close, like Granny and Ross, Alexander High, and we grew up all, which is funny, we all went to Oak Creek together. We are all the same grade. So basically that's kind of how we all fell in line. So we were like in that same grade, and it was probably only like less than 100 kids. And then the idea is, if you're all playing soccer on the team, like obviously only 20 or 25 of them are going to be into it, right? And then you could obviously up that, find the ones that you're going to be friends with. So it was like through soccer, through like other things that kind of like coalesced in its original form. But then like, you stick it out with certain friends, and I didn't realize that like, and I kind of like take it for granted. Whereas like, oh, if you have friends from like elementary school days or junior high school days or high school days, it's like it should be like a good thing, or it should be, it's like kind of unusual sometimes, right? Or people kind of find it unusual, especially if it's from like grade school or something like that. Or like, oh, that's like awesome. Or like people don't always find it the norm. So like in some ways, I was like, we were lucky to have that kind of like similarity where, and I guess like general closeness where if you could form like friendships like that, and basically you're kind of like, you know, at this point we're reflecting on it now. We're like, oh, we're really lucky to have like all had similar like interests, but also like we were reflecting on how all our parents are really similar in a lot of ways, and how our parents are all like very forward thinking, but all like are high on like education, high on family, and high on being like, I guess you could say, proactive. So in a lot of ways, like the like the moral, I guess you could say, like placement of our parents, like where our parents wanted to be like their kids to be like morally like shaped us to be very similar. And then like Oswego was, a good facilitator, that in the way that like, we could basically like, have, I guess you could say, like a perspective of being in the bubble while you're living in the bubble, like knowing what the bubble is while living in the bubble. That's kind of like the whole idea, where if you can understand that, like, hey, this world, or like this city or this town that we live in, it's it's great, or it can seem great, right? Like it can seem like the teachers are good, and the environment is safe relatively, and everything is like, easy living compared to like, the rest of the world in perspective, right? If you can like take that, but also like know that like, oh, there's certain factors that will like skew that world, right? And there's definitely factors where it's like, oh, we live in a very white town, that's going to skew that world. So if you're going to be aware of those things while living in town, that's great. And if you can have like, minority allies, or even white allies, white friends, or like, white acquaintances, the people that recognize that, that's even better, right? So that's where I was saying I felt like my class in '06, well, they picked up the ball a little bit better on like being mature, and then being better, not being better, but like understanding race perspective a little bit better. I honestly felt like from afar, um, your guys' class, there's definitely a few outliers where I'd be like, wow, I would have been like tough getting some of those people like on board, right? Just because I feel like it's a whole different ball game, like each year to each year, right? It's a different set of different type of people, different set of clique. So I definitely think that like, you know, it shaped us in a lot of ways, like for the better, mentally, but also it's going to propel you in like thinking that you can have like a little bit more of like forethought, or like a dream or something that like you can be thinking toward in the future, and it's a lot more possible, right? things felt a lot more possible in some degree living in the bubble, especially when we had like, Kevin Love in '06 and Yuri 07. It was like, oh, if he's gonna go to the NBA, like that's kind of a cool perspective, like it's in our gym. But it's hard to put that in the picture, right? We don't necessarily know what's gonna happen in the future. So, but I feel like it's like, we're not entirely a small town, but it's like small town with like big dreams in a lot of ways, right? There's like a lot of kids that like can have big dreams, and like if they work hard and they come out from the system, they can do well, right? I feel like there's a lot of kids like I saw in those Asian clubs where I'm like, wow, these kids are smart, and like these kids are like gonna kill it because they're like very forward thinking, they're very proactive, and like they're actually like can do kids, like kids that like want to do good, right? It's like kind of built into them. So I feel like that's like a good, it's a positive feedback loop in a lot of cases where I'm like, wow, the I'm sure some educators like inspired them, or like it was some, to some degree where they had like some forward thinking there, or like in spite of that, right? If you had like a moment where a teacher acts against you, like my Mr. Moore, I didn't hold it necessarily against them, just but I was just like, it might have revealed a few suspicions, and but in general, I was like, wow, he can still be a good educator in other regards, but I was like, oh, his emotional reaction told me more than anything, right? So it was a case where I'm like, oh, some people can separate that, and that kind of like is the good mark of an educator, right? A good educator can like, separate what they're teaching from like who they are, but also have like perspective to like, be factual, or also be like, be self-aware. And then, the overall like landscape when you walk around like nowadays, it's like you tell people, or you say you meet someone new, you say your name, you tell them who you are. They might ask you like where you're from or where you went to school, and so like I don't have any problem telling people like, oh, I'm from Null, I went to like a lot of people I'm with, not a lot of people, but some people I'm with, they're like, oh, we don't like to say it out loud, or oh, like we don't say it out in public, but like they say it as a joke too, like just off the cuff. They don't actually care that much, but I think so for some people outside of it, it can draw in a different perspective, and people are like, oh, you're from LO, that's why, like, and they definitely might throw some stereotypes in their head, or like in their mind, but I feel like that's just a great opportunity to like flip it, right? I almost kind of like lead with it, I think, almost feel like it's a little bit of like armor. You like you can almost like disarm them in some ways and be like, oh no, I'm from a like not like I know what you're saying, bubble, it's a bubble, but it's like the bubble within the bubble thing. And if you can kind of like not necessarily joke about it, but like observe and like, basically be aware of those things, and then also like, you know, not fight back, but I feel like you should stand up for yourself and stand up for like the things that you believe in, and generally they'll be taken upon pretty well. Yeah, most of the small incidental like conversational like arguments I've had with people like that, or like strangers in general, when you say something back to them and it's actually like factual, or something like something that is like going to clear their perspective, they just shut up, or most of the time they just don't know what to say, or they just kind of repeat the same thing over and over. So it's good to stand up for yourself in that regard, just because like most of the time, you're going to be leading with a better perspective than they are, and they're leading with whatever their is in their head at the time, and then you know not kill them with kindness, but like retort, and you can say it however you want, but in general, like uh, you know, people say things with mouths and people say things without mouths, right? Understanding that is also a little important too, right? Because a lot of times, like malicious intent is a big thing. But yeah, I think carrying it with you is like something we'll always like have in the back of our heads. It's like the LO mindset or the LO education. But in a lot of cases, it's a good duality. So
It's funny you talked about how some people really are hesitant to kind of say out loud, "Hey, I grew up in LO," and that's definitely thing I've experienced, not just with people we went to school with, but also a lot of these younger generations as well. But like you said, like when I don't know, when you just, I guess for lack of better words, you own it. Again, I don't think there's nothing to really own there, but just like, yeah, this is where I came from. This is kind of like, this does shape my perspective in these ways. I think I was talking with a student for one of these interviews who's currently in college, and she brought up a point where it's like, some of the experiences just from LO and knowing how to like navigate certain things are somewhat akin to sort of like that university campus experience in a way that like she has that perspective in a way like some of her peer group doesn't have, and vice versa, like they're able to share experiences, kind of just like trade, I guess, experiences, perspectives, understandings to get yeah, just have a better understanding and more fuller understanding of how the world works and how different places work and how to navigate and bring all that together. And I think that's helpful, with just LO. I always come back to like on one hand, yes, it is absolutely a bubble. And I had a parent tell me the other day that, they're in some of these classes, there's kids who actually literally look at Portland like a whole other country. So, but still, I think emphasizing that interconnectedness is vital. Yeah. So, we talked about like how it shaped life and career, but I guess like specifically, I'm curious if you got into film while you were in LO schools or if that was something that came later.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So the whole idea that kind of came from like your basic high school English video project, right? Or just a project, right? So probably at the end of a book, end of a term, you have a big project, the group project, like 3 or 4 person project. You can either do like a reenactment or you can usually do like a video, right? Or like a speech or like a video. And so like when they started accepting videos, I was like, oh wow, it's kind of a great good, I guess you could say, like concept to present something, right? So much easier, and you don't have to fucking sorry, you don't have to actually do anything on the day of. So the whole idea was, you know, we could basically go, and take a normal video project and go super try hard with it. And this basically like, you know, take a project about Hamlet, and the whole first project that we did this for was like Mr. McNeil. Sorry, so I forgot his name, but I know he still teaches there, and so he's like a very seminal teacher that I had there. But so like for English, Mr. McNeil would offer like the option of doing like a video option if you wanted to do it instead of like a written or like a oral presentation. So most of the kids, not most of the kids, but a lot of kids are just like, oh yeah, this will be fun, or like, oh yeah, we can definitely skirt by on the video. We'll just like, you know, just throw it together and just kind of like mock it up. It'll be easier doing speeches, right? So the high school, you know, senior or not like a junior year Hamlet project ended up being like kind of a really big impetus for things, just because we viewed it as something where it's like, oh, we can go super try hard with this, and we can really like, um I guess you could say like take it seriously where no one thinks we're going to take it seriously. Sorry, I'm trying to adjust my camera. So we took a scene from like Guildenstern and Rosencrantz getting assassinated, and we basically like the Ethan Hawke version, you don't see the actual like event happening off screen. You just hear Ethan Hawke's Hamlet talking about the event, like as it's going to go down. And basically, he's like, talking about how he says he's going to do it, but he's saying it in prose, and he's saying it basically how Hamlet speaks. So we did the same thing. Phil Hutzel was playing Hamlet lead character. He definitely like likes the camera. Did that great. He wanted to do. He's like a definitely like a person who like was good for that role and like wanted to be out there. And then we had the filler roles. Todd in for someone else, and then myself, and then we brought in a couple of friends. Like Carl Glussman basically was one of the was Guildenstern. So the whole idea was we took that scene, adapted it, almost not shot it frame for frame, but we basically took like the same cadence. So we took like an opening shot that was like, this long, but we would, frame it a different way. And so we we went super try hard. I remember going down to a local hotel off Westlake, and we had like uh a wheelchair just like borrowed, and we were like using that. But I remember asking them at the lobby, like, "Oh, we're shooting a high school film project. Is there any way we could borrow like a room real quick?" It was kind of like a big ask, but it was like looking back on that, but looking back on Ben, I did not think it was a big ask, and I just was like, yeah, they're gonna give it to us if we're super nice about it, or for like students, and they're like, yeah, it's like a dead day or like whatever, and they're like, okay, sure, it's a student project, why not? So we do like a few scenes like with the dolly, with the wheelchair, like down the hall, whatever. And it's super smooth just because like, hotels are kind of built that way. And I remember being like, oh, people were gonna be like this shot is turning out pretty well. So if like this actually works out, like this will actually like, be representative of what we're trying to do with like the actual film. Um, and so we shot the whole thing, but the whole idea in the original scene, and in most instances of the play, you never see the two random assassins getting killed by Hamlet or dying. Um, but in our scene, we just basically had Bill Hutzel like waking up, and it was kind of like, it sounds cheesy, but the whole idea was basically waking up and Carl Glusman had a lightsaber. It was basically like attacking him, like and like in the night. So the whole weird thing, the funnier thing about it is when we went even more try hard, I wanted the action, and I wanted like the connect, like actual fighting to be quick and just like fast edits, but we wanted to be like actual like real or quick, not using like toy blades or anything like that. So we took really really thin PVC pipes, and the whole idea was like, oh, you can use those, but then you have to fill it in with effects, right? You have to do frame by frame. It's called rotoscoping. Now it's very very common, but back then it was like oh 02, oh 03. It's like very very uncommon to even have that software like After Effects basically to do it. Nowadays, if it was released, it would have been like a lot bigger deal, like or like if a kid was doing it then. So but that whole idea was we're going to do that scene. People aren't going to expect it to us to be try hard, but then we're going to have like something even funnier or like something that's an even bigger deal. And we've been Star Wars fans, like the lightsabers. And then like, oh, if we actually do it well, we have good music, good timing, good editing. It's basically going to be like, oh, people are like, oh, they're taking it seriously. Like they don't know how to react basically. So the PVC, we had a really good scene where it was like a few, basically parries, back and forth. And then Phil like kills Carl. We don't really know who he dies, and he has like a line that he delivers as he dies, and then the scene just plays out just as normal after that. But I remember rotoscoping that, and it took a long time. But I was like, oh man, we're gonna make this like I'm gonna put all the effort into it to make it look good. And it's the same technique that you would use in a normal film. Same idea. You're just basically taking a frame, and you're basically like sometimes the blade is like this thin, but then when it moves, it's like a blade. It's like a big thing. So you have to pick and make it basically look right when the full motion is 28 frames a second. So if you have like 3 seconds of footage, basically it's 3 times 28. So 84 there. So the whole idea is like we went pretty try hard, pretty like I guess you could say like all out on that project for fun, and we used music from I think it was like The Machinist. So we were using like scores from like actual film, like cheating in that regard, right? So if it's like a really good score and you're like using this, and it's like, oh, of course, you're like, I can put this together You're using like a real soundtrack. But in high school, no one really cares. So like that project came out, and I remember people being like, their reaction being like really good, like pretty good, but like a lot of people were like quiet, and they were like, oh my god, lightsabers, and like I remember Carrie Granlund, who does writing now, and she's written on a few Disney projects, so she's like a real writer and done like features and stuff. But she like messaged me on IG like 2 or 3 years out of the blue, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I hope you're doing well, or whatever." But she wanted to say, I always remember the high school Hamlet project, the lightsabers, because that was fucking amazing. Like she was basically was saying that, like she was like that was amazing, and I'll never like forget like how all out you guys went on that. And I was like, not really thinking ever of that much at that time. I was like, oh, that's actually funny that you said that. But like, we definitely try hard. I remember Mr. McNeil being like, not like really quiet about it, but he was just like, that was great. Like he wasn't like didn't have much to say. He was like, that was awesome. I think he was just really like happy that we put a lot of effort into like an English project of his and like took it far and beyond. But we're like, oh yeah, like that was an example of setting it up. And then after that, in senior year, we did another adaptation of Brokeback Mountain. We basically did a trailer of Brokeback Mountain, and we call it Brokeback Mountain Park. So Mountain Park, we were doing a play on Mountain Park, but with that, it went another step further because we took an actual scene, like a scene between Ennis and Jake Gyllenhaal's character. I forgot his other name, but they have a scene in the movie where it's like they're really emotional, they go all out, and it's not really a scene that's like too played out, but there's that really famous line in it where it's like, I wish I knew how to quit you. Then it's really, really seminal in that line. Everyone knows it, and that's kind of like the line gets memed on. But we did the same thing where we did the trailer, and so like the first half of it plays out like a trailer, like a montage, but then it plays out in the actual scene, or like the real, like an actual like scene where like they actually just talk. It's for like a minute and a half or 2 minutes. So like in a trailer, they would never do that. So it's that emotional scene, and we're like basically having Phil Hutzel and Kevin Hall play the two leads, play Jake Gyllenhaal, Heath Ledger, and they're going all out. Like they're basically like real tears. Like they're going all out on these performances, and I'm like, it's only 3 or 4 of us, and that's why I think I made it easy. I was like, wow, this is actually a really small like environment. This is actually good. I can just tell them to like go out, and they don't feel self conscious about it, because like that's really hard to ask. I don't think I could do it myself. So the Phil and Kevin are different people. They're very open to those kind of ideas. So they went all out on a scene. It's like, I wish I knew how to quit you. Damn you, Innes. It's like pretty like that's more one to one. They were matching lines, and they were definitely saying things that like were just repeated in the film. So that was like kind of the next level of like, oh, we're going to take a normal project and we're going to go really serious with it. We're going to take a topic or an idea that people are going to think that we're memeing on or that we're joking about, like in the first half, and it's just like a montage. We're going to actually like play up and ramp it in seriousness and take it serious. So at the end, that you actually like feel like, oh, those guys were actually like, well, or wanted to like tell, like be serious about it or have real perspective about it. So then when we had after that in that senior year, um, the the assembly, Cooper Gango and Gang, they put together a high school film festival, which was really cool. So basically, they had because Cooper is a huge film guy, so he put together like a committee and then like an event in the auditorium, and so that was really early on. He just basically had like a setup like on a Saturday night or a Sunday night where people would just like we would watch all the films and then people would like rank them or judge them. So like I think it was like 7 or 8 other things, and then we screened Hamlet, and then we screened Brokeback Mountain Park. I think they're back to back or whatever. But that whole film festival was like, I remember the auditorium being actually really like those reception was really good. People are actually like really interested, and like I was really surprised that like the community actually like coming together for it, which was cool. But also Cooper did a really good job with it in hindsight, and I should definitely like you know say that now to him or reach out to him again. But like it just in general, like as a student to put that together, and then also like he had his own films like that he submitted. He's into it as well. He was on the judging committee, so like it was him and like 3 other people I think that were like on the judging committee, and then like all the at the end of the day they were tally up or they counted up everything, and then Cooper, all the people who were had presented films were up on stage, and Cooper like because me and Cooper actually were really good OG friends. We were kindergarten friends, like as best friends. So kindergarten through like first and second grade, that's when we were like our best friend years. Basically, we were good friends throughout life, but like our best years were like actually kindergarten through first and second grade. So like me and Cooper went a long ways at that point, and so Cooper like pulled me aside and was just like, okay, so which one do you want to win, Brokeback Mountain Park or Hamlet? And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, for first and second. And I was like, oh, he's like, you can pick. And I was like, oh, really? And I was like, okay. Um, and then I thought about like who was in the cast today and what meant more. And I picked Brokeback Mountain Park, I think on emotion. And I also think just because like the actors gave so much more to it, and Hamlet was just more straightforward. But I remember Carl for Hamlet being a little like not peeved, but he was a little on me about it. He's like, you should have picked him. Why did you pick Hamlet? It's like the better one overall. Which I think actually like to his credit, it was a better, yeah, it was a better piece overall. It was better technically. But oh, like I thought it was really funny because I was like, oh man, Cooper has his own like skin in the game, and he's obviously like really invested in this, but he was still like nice enough to like offer that up or like say that up because I was like, we were try hard, and I think in some regards, like me and Cooper just were never in the same English class together, right? We just never had the opportunity to like be together. And he's a DP now. He actually works as a cinematographer and all that stuff, right? And takes a lot of pictures and stuff. He's a totally into photography. So the whole idea is that like, oh, our paths could have or should have crossed, and they still can because I'm still into directing and writing, right? So eventually that still can totally and should be eventuality. But either way, it was like Cooper putting that together and then like everyone actually coming and then like parents being there. My parents were there, I remember. So when they presented and the Cooper was like, gave out like a third, second, and then like a audience choice award, and then like I think a couple like acting, like basically like standout kind of nominations. Um, and then when I remember when I went up on stage to say something for like Brokeback Mountain Park, I remember just kind of like in my head bombing the speech really bad or just being like really fidgety or just not really saying much and just being like really incoherent because at that point I was just like not ready for public speaking, but I also didn't think that like I'd have to say anything, or also didn't think like there'd be any real implications. I thought they would just like say it or whatever. So the whole idea was like, oh, this is a really awesome thing, and it totally that stuff propelled everyone because Carl went on to go to New York, went on to become an actor, basically took his dream to the next level because he always told me that in Lake Oswego, and this is actually a really good perspective, that he said that Lake Oswego, he never wanted to come out and be like openly with acting and say like, oh, I'm an actor and being into acting because he always thought that like, oh, he get made fun of or he get like lumped in that group because he was a good athlete. He fit in with like kind of our group, the mathletes and the athletes, right? And the jocks, right? So he was like kind of in between because he's a nice guy. He could fit in all the loggers, but ideally someone who's like that, like kind of sunk in being in the acting or theater, like that definitely would have been like a weird belt. And especially if he was like committed, right? Because he's a very committed actor. That's very, very like unusual. I think like he didn't want that perspective or want that like, and I get it too, because it's like optics are a certain thing, but as a kid, you don't really know that like, oh, I should just be myself and I should just send it. But that was the Hamlet thing was a huge impetus because I remember him pulling me aside and for that project and being like, hey, next project, like let's like put me in it or like I'm gonna be in it or like I'll be your actor. I was like, okay, like he actually like not manhandled me, but he like actually like not he's a really nice guy. But like the first time he like actually grabbed me, I was like okay, like sure, like let's totally like work on the next thing, and then ended up being the Hamlet thing, and then in general like yeah, he went to New York. Carrie went to Chapman, and I remember after that festival, Carrie like reached out and like she was about to go off to Chapman. Um, so this was like a month after the festival, right after we got out of school, and she was like, "Oh, I wonder if you could come over and like just we could just talk about like film and just talk about like scripts and talk about like oh like stuff like that because I'm going off to school." She had like a lot of questions, and I was like, "Oh, that's cool." Like she's just being like super nice and like reaching out, and I was like, man, I don't feel like I'm that far ahead of you guys. I just did like a few projects, but really it was just a case where like that we had a good outlet for it, right? If we just were doing video projects on our own, they would probably kind of be stupid. We wouldn't have an audience for it in some ways, right? So in some regards, it's like a 30-person, 28-person forced audience for that 5 minutes. We were just trying to send it for, right? I'm like, oh, you're gonna be forced to watch this in a dark room. Everyone's gonna be like snoring or doing whatever during those other projects, but it's like, oh, we're gonna actually like wrap some people up. We're gonna try it. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah, and the fact you said you had McNeil makes so much sense too. I had him for film studies, which I didn't go into film obviously, but I still look at that as probably like one of the most impactful classes that sticks with me, both in terms of like one, how I just engage with TV and film and storytelling, but then also in just kind of like training your mind in a different way. Again, just to like engage with things, to see things, to even, like I said, not like in ways you do writing, in ways you do sort of like these other activities that you wouldn't think of, but like having that, just the idea of framing, you know, and how that incorporates. But then also, I think just having these opportunities to really like dive all the way in, whether it's in this like explicitly professional way or in a way where, in your case, where you're talking about, it's like, no, we're going to go after this. Like, we're going to take a professional approach, especially when people maybe aren't expecting it as well. Like I know when I had the opportunity to write for the Elo Review, one of the favorite pieces of feedback I got was some letter saying, I'm glad you don't write my dog Jake stories. And I was like, just something simple as that, but it's like you see that like I'm serious and getting like you said, like even having that audience of, you can say like a captive audience of 30 people, but like that engagement, like that sticks with you. And that, like I said, it was a launching point for a lot of people. And I just think that environment, you know, again, just like I don't know, listen to the way you're just like talking about that film festival and those memories. Like I when I think about like sort of like prescriptive purposes of these interviews, and I hope not just particularly they're for students, but also I do hope, teachers, administrators, people, the city, the school district look at stuff like this and say, support these opportunities, because like you talk about just like that sense of purpose you get and, you know, one, the opportunity to build community, but also build sense of purpose, build potential careers through just, again, giving students these opportunities to really immerse themselves and really, just dive all the way into their creativity and expression. So last for one, I just want to thank you again for taking the time. But one thing I always ask people with these interviews, it's just like, do you have any parting advice for current students right now, specifically current students of color going through the Elo experience? I know you've shared a lot of insights and so like things that work, things that didn't. But yeah, is there just anything else you'd add as far as advice?
No, it's a great question. So, it's hard to say, but I think a few things that probably would stand out just as like landmarks and like kind of as like a guiding light or like a North Star would be find like like the people that you vibe with and then find like allies, right? Find the people that like are gonna be like proactively, progressive or proactively the people that want to be around, right? I think definitely in my grade there was kids that were like ahead of their age or like more mature that definitely like you could find as like, the white ally, right? Or as like and then obviously like, if you have fellow, people like yourself, like, fellow Chinese, fellow Indians, fellow African Americans, fellow like any like it doesn't even have to be a racial thing, right? It just have to be like people that you can like find I guess you could say like similar wavelengths and then similar like perspectives on people that are progressive. And I think like if you can do that, that'll definitely like be something you can rely on. Because if you're not able to find anyone that you can like be similar with, but also like can confide in, it's going to be like a harder journey. It's going to be a longer journey, right? And I think the struggle with any of the kids, like as minorities growing up, when I grew up, and for me, is at times too, for sure, is like when you're isolated, right? Or you're too isolated, like from your friend group, or when you feel isolated, or you feel like, um, or there's times or grades where you're more isolated, or like, classes where you're more isolated too and you're just like, oh, this class is like I have no allies in this class, or like I have like two or three allies, right? And like maybe the teacher is like, barely even there, like not barely even there, but like, on the fence, so it's like I have to win them over too. So I think in general, if you can find people that you can confide in, that will give you a lot of strength and confidence. And I think too is that like, be try to be more outspoken than you like to be. And it's hard easy to say that, but like I think in general, you'll find that the people that are combative, they'll either back down or they won't have good reason to put up with it. And then the people that really um, can see that in you and really believe those things, they'll stand out even more or they'll reach out to you even more, right? And I think in general, like, if you can like, it's not like completely the adage where it's like quiet mouth doesn't get fed, but it's like if you're not outspoken, people won't ever see that you have those kind of thoughts, right? You could be completely like progressive, forward thinking, and like be very outspoken, like in your mind, and if you never say those things, then it's like it might not ever actualize, right? Or at least for other people, right? So it's like if you can build that sort of like shared thought, at least amongst your peers or at least amongst your allies, like you can win over your classmates for perspective. That can be huge, right? So I think some ways like you don't always have to do that with like your teacher per se, but it's more so like navigating that with your peers, right? Navigating like the battle with your peers in terms of like winning them over, but then winning over like enemies, right? Or like you don't have to win them over, but you have to like if you can say your piece and like leave it as that, you've done all you can, right? And then the right ones will fall, and then the wrong ones, they never would have anyways. So yeah, I think just be true to yourself in that regard, but then also like you know do the thing that you wanted to do, like with the film festival, right? If you wanted like go all out with like a community event, if you want to throw something together, put something together in the gymnasium or the auditorium, and it's like, oh, I have to get like permission out to do this and that. It seems like a big deal. I would say don't be ever afraid to try it, or don't be afraid to do it, because the kids that like I realize in Lake Oswego, most kids are afraid to do that a little bit, right? It's kind of like a big town, or like kind of like a big like I guess you could say like complex, or like a big, I guess you could say infrastructure. So like it definitely intimidates kids in some degrees, where it's like, oh, if I wanted to like, throw something or put something together, like they'll never take me seriously, like okay, they'll never come sort of thing. But it's like, no, if you actually like put your effort into it, put your enthusiasm into it, you'd be surprised how many other people will follow. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, again, just great advice. And yeah, David, thank you. Thank you again for taking the time today. And hopefully, again, people are listening, because I think, this is important. It's good perspective. And like you said, as far as putting yourself out there, and I say this as someone who's definitely was super introverted. I mean, to this day, but also like especially in high
same.
school,
Yeah.
you know, where when you have those moments where you are able to put yourself out there and be successful, like that can be life changing, you
Yeah.
know. And like I said, it's easier said than done, but you know, also to your point about like finding your support systems, finding those around you, like these are things that can absolutely help with that. So yeah, again, I hopefully for those in positions of power, positions with access to resources for this, please keep supporting these efforts in town. And yeah, again, David, thank you for taking the time tonight.
Of course, it was a great conversation. Great questions. I feel like I didn't have the answers when you're asking them, and then it began to unravel. And I feel like we had a very similar perspective in terms of when we grew up. So I feel like hopefully, the situation and the environment seems to be a lot better for these kids. Not that it was bad for us, but it's just improved, right? It's more progressive, and these kids nowadays, they're very motivated, they're very positive. So it's great to see.
Absolutely. Absolutely.